Hello, my name is Bessie Noll, and I am currently a doctoral research student at ETH Zurich. I am studying energy, science, and policy with the Energiepolitik group. And as a bit of an interim to my PhD, I have had the great pleasure and opportunity to work with SES. And specifically, I have been working on the project related to the 10-year anniversary of the Fukushima earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear disaster of March 11, 2011. It's been 10 years already, if you can believe it. And as part of this project, SES is doing a bit of an homage to the disaster that happened, and has been fortunate enough to send me to sort of research and understand a bit what's happening today on the ground 10 years later, interview a few residents who had evacuated from the areas, and also travel to Tōhoku to see the sites, to see how far certain cities have come in terms of recovery, and to sort of get a sense of what Japan's future is in regards to nuclear energy. This is a project that's very close to me, and I'm very happy to have had the opportunity. I was, in fact, in 10th grade, I was in chemistry class when the earthquake hit. And I remember that day very vividly. It's hard to forget the biggest earthquake you've ever felt. So having this chance to return now 10 years later and research and learn about things that I didn't know in full or even in half at the time has been truly memorable. So maybe just to start with a bit of background, the events that happened on March 11th were extraordinary and devastating, following a 9.0 magnitude earthquake just off of the coast of Tōhoku, which is sort of northern Honshu, Japan. A tsunami quickly followed, and it devastated about 500 kilometers of coastline, destroying homes, businesses, schools. Over 200,000 evacuees fled, and many of them have not returned home. Over 20,000 people were dead or presumed dead on the day, either from the earthquake or from the following tsunami. And on top of that, as if that wasn't enough, as a consequence of the tsunami, the TEPCO Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, located in Fukushima prefecture, but Futaba town, was flooded, and the backup generators that were located in the basement of the plant drowned. Without cooling, reactors 1, 2, and 3 all melted down and sort of melted or burned through the bottom of the core containment vessel. And with the ensuing hydrogen explosions that followed in the days after, this radioactive fuel was then exposed to the atmosphere. And ultimately, a 30-kilometer radius evacuation zone was established, a no-go zone. And this has remained in place to some extent for 10 years. Certain cities have been reopened between 2011 and today. But ultimately, these reopenings have been slow. Many of the towns are still very slow to recover, slow to rebuild. And in particular, the towns that were closest to the nuclear power plant, Namie and Futaba, I was able to visit this past January. They are not yet recovered, and they have a long ways to go in terms of being livable once again. These towns are empty. There's very few people, no commerce, little food. Not many people have chosen to return, so in Namie in particular, this is few and far between people that still live there. And Futaba town was just reopened in March of 2020. No one is allowed to still live there. Supposedly this coming year, the government will lift this restriction, and Futaba residents may choose to return if they wish. But this is hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine somebody returning to Futaba town. It's, in particular, not entirely open. In fact, most of the town is still contaminated. Only 2% of the town itself, so the sort of the city center, is open. And while there have been sort of new elements that have returned or that have been built to sort of bring life back into Futaba, as well as Namie, it's got a long ways to go still. My trip to Tōhoku in January of 2021 was certainly harrowing, yes, but also very exciting and encouraging to see how far many of these towns have come 10 years later in terms of recovery. I took a Shinkansen from Tokyo up to Sendai, which is the main port, or not port, the main station in northern Japan. And from there I rented a car and did a bit of a road trip along the coastline to hit many of the towns that were affected. I went all the way up to the northern town of Ofunato, which is a small fishing port town. Then down to Rikuzen Takata, as well as Ishinomaki City, which is a larger city near Sendai. And then further down south, near the TEPCO Daiichi power plants, I visited both the towns of Namie and Futaba. In particular, the towns that were not affected by the nuclear disaster and have had 10 years of rebuild time, it's amazing to see how far they've come. The Japanese are incredibly resilient people. They already have new fishing ports in the center of town. Much of the economy has returned to normal. Schools have been rebuilt. Homes have been rebuilt. A lot of residents who were evacuated have returned even. And that's not to say that, the memory of 2011 has gone. By no means will this be forgotten. And still today, many people are hurting from these events, but largely they are moving on and they are working through. And when you meet with people from these towns, in particular, Ishinomaki, I met with 3 different individuals there. They're excited to share the work that they've done, and they're excited to share what happened on that day. And they know that they have work to do, but for them, it's an incredible source of pride for them to be able to be back on their feet. And that was very apparent in many of these towns, not only with the people themselves, but also with the infrastructure. I mean, many of these homes have been rebuilt in full. There are large swaths of seawall being built by the national government all along the coastline to sort of prevent, or at least give people of these towns more time should a similar event occur in the future. These are no easy tasks, and it was very encouraging to sort of see how this has played out. That said, this is not quite true of the towns that were within the evacuation zone of the 30 kilometers radius near the Fukushima Daiichi plants. Namie and Futaba town were extraordinarily different in comparison to the northern towns. It's hard to sort of convey in words exactly what I experienced and maybe even what I expected during this trip. I knew that to some extent these towns would be hard to see. Futaba in particular has only recently been reopened, but I did not know just how desolate, ghost town, eerie, sort of empty feelings you would have. These are not towns that you would want to live in. They're certainly not towns that you would want to raise children in. And part of the issue, of course, is the government wants people to return back. And in Namie town, there are signs of this. Namie has had residents return, and in fact, I spoke with a few who live part-time now in Namie, and hope to return in full in the future when things are kind of back up on their feet. But largely, these 2 towns were ghostly. I mean, we went to the main train station in Namie, and there's sort of a single taxi cab waiting there for no one. You have large plots of land that just are empty. Homes have been demolished because they were rotting for 10 years. And of the homes that are still standing, many of them are kind of on the brink of collapse, or windows are smashed. People had been in looting in the years after the disaster. These are not homes that you would hope to return to. And that's in Japanese what they would call kitsui. This is 大変だけど kitsui. It's tough. It's hard to imagine, as I said, what it would look like to rebuild a life in these towns. In particular, what I found most difficult to comprehend was the contrast, a very stark contrast, actually, between the dark, desolate, kind of ghostly vibe that you feel upon visiting with the new, sparkly rebuild efforts. In Futaba town, there has been a new train station built just a year ago that is fantastic, and it stands in the center of the town, and it's bright and shiny. And right behind it on the platform in the back are bags of contaminated radioactive soil piled 4 bags high. And then written on the bags are large green letters that say, "Let's start the future of Futaba town." So there's this constant contrast, right? And if you go sort of further out of the town, there's this amazing architectural memorial museum in Futaba, and it's obviously been sort of planned, and there's been a lot of money thrown into it, and it was an amazing sort of museum itself. But right next to it, of course, is one of the larger decontamination sites for all of these millions of bags. I mean, million cubic meters, like many, many tons of volume is being sort of collected and processed. In Namiye town, it was the same. You have the town itself, which is, sparsely sort of habited, but then also just a lot of plots lay empty. And then as you sort of move outside of the town, there's this very new state-of-the-art green hydrogen production plant, hydrogen from renewable energy. This is cutting-edge stuff. This is very expensive and progressive engineering. These contrasts were really hard to reconcile. I think as a visitor, it was just, that was what was sort of lasting for me. How do you make sense of this? You have money being thrown into these towns, but there's nobody here. There's nobody here to enjoy it. There's nobody here to live it. So then you might ask, well, maybe people are coming back. But for my money, it's been 10 years already. It's hard to believe in another 10 years the cities will be thriving again. I think this will take more time, and I'm not sure what it looks like. I'm not sure how it will look 10, 20 years from now. So there's this contrast, and then there's this other contrast with cities that were not part of the nuclear evacuation zone. So sort of the towns that I visited up north, Ishinomaki, Ofunato, these towns had life. They had people there to recover, and Nami and Futaba did not. So there was this contrast as well. And as resilient as the Japanese people are, to some extent, you need the human element, you need the human spirit to be there to recover. And it was very obvious that that was missing in Namiye and Futaba. These are the lasting consequences of nuclear power. And so one might ask, well, what is the future of nuclear power in Japan? Given everything that's happened since 2011, wouldn't Japan choose to wane off of nuclear and find some other alternative, safer source of power generation? This has not been the case. And there are a few reasons for this. One in particular being the incumbent political system that has championed nuclear energy for many, many years and has had a tight grasp on energy policy and energy politics in Japan. This bureaucracy has been very difficult to break and will continue to be difficult to break. Currently, in 2020, about 7% of Japan's energy supply was provided by nuclear power. In the most recent basic energy plan, the 5th basic energy plan, Japan has stated that they hope for this to be about 20 to 22% nuclear by 2030. They are by no means waning off of nuclear. Nuclear will continue to stay in Japan. That said, it has become inhibitively expensive in many cases. I was able to have an interview with former Prime Minister Naoto Kan in late January in his office in Mitaka. He was the Prime Minister at the time of the earthquake in 2011 and obviously had an incredible story and a huge amount of responsibility, and since then has been an adamant anti-nuclear advocate and has worked tirelessly to move Japan away from nuclear and towards renewables. In particular, Kan is very excited about solar, and he is promoting solar intensely in Japan. In 2012, a feed-in tariff policy, which was established under Kan's tenure, allowed investors of varying size to produce and feed renewable electricity back into the grid at a fixed rate. And with this feed-in tariff policy, the percentage of renewables that made up the total electricity supply took off. And today, roughly about 18% of Japan's electricity supply is made up of renewables, and solar has made a huge contribution to that. Essentially, nuclear power is too expensive to maintain, and this is Naoto Kan's argument. There's no way around the economic irrationality of choosing nuclear over solar, for example. Currently, nuclear stands at about 15 yen per kilowatt hour, where solar can be as low as 5 yen per kilowatt hour. This is too cheap to ignore. And Kan's thinking is that no matter how strong the hold of the bureaucracy is on sort of the nuclear system in Japan, the nuclear energy system, eventually it will be too cheap to ignore. If you ask me, I think Japan is headed in the right direction. They've set a net zero carbon target for 2050. They're pushing the development of renewables. They are cognizant of the changes that the energy system needs to make to reach these goals. Part of that vision will include nuclear. There's no doubt about it. And I think for me, the question is, how can you reconcile that with everything that's happened? And I know that it's not an easy answer and that there's no sort of one thing to consider. Japan's an isolated island nation. They do not have natural resources to support themselves. Renewable energies can make up a large portion of the energy, but the energy supply, but not all, for example. Japan has to think about other ways to power themselves. And in particular, one quote from Masafumi-san, a resident of Namie that I interviewed with, really stuck with me. Masafumi-san was born and grew up in Namie. He has lived there his whole life. He always knew the TEPCO nuclear power plant to be there. He lived with it there. And one of the things he said to me in our interview was, the people of Namie have learned to coexist with nuclear. And that was a difficult statement for me. I understand where he's coming from. I understand what he means. The Japanese culture is deeply rooted in sacrifice, and part of what it represents to be in a town that is near a power plant or that hosts a power plant is the idea that we are providing power for the rest of Japan. We are sacrificing to provide power for the rest of Japan. And that is an incredibly important component of the culture, to be sacrificial in that sense. I think for me, what I maybe don't quite understand is, given everything that's happened and given that Masafumi was displaced from his home for many years and still today cannot live in Namie full time, at what point is enough enough? For me, I don't quite understand what that means.